Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and fifth debate in this series. My name is Nabeel, Qureshi, and I'm here with Acts 17 Ministries. This series will be continued today with two debates. The first one in the afternoon, which you're here for currently, is Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? It's a debate on the historicity of the resurrection. And this evening we'll continue with Did Jesus claim to be divine, or who was Jesus? And that will be debated at 6 o'clock this evening. I wanted to make some brief announcements before we begin. First, in the foyer, in the atrium area, you did see some books and some CDs. Those are free for you to take. There's a New Testament, there is a Case for Easter, and also there is a More Than Dreams CD, which has stories of Muslims who saw dreams which led them to Christianity. So please feel free to take these. Take them for yourself, take them for your friends. No need to ask. Just go ahead and take them for you. In addition, I'd like to ask everyone to turn off any pagers or cell phones, put them on vibrate. If you have a pager or a cell phone, just go ahead and double check, make sure it's off, because sometimes we think it is and it's not because they have a mind of their own. So please do that. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's debates. He is Dr. James White. He is from Phoenix, Arizona, a teacher of the Bible, as well as he has his own ministry, AOMIN, Alpha and Omega Ministries. He debated on Friday, and today he will be moderating. Dr. White?
We have a very brief amount of time, relatively speaking, this afternoon, so I will try to be brief. What we will do this afternoon is we will have two 20-minute opening statements, followed by two 10-minute rebuttals. We will take a break. We need to take at least one break for the television cameras. We'll let you know. That will come right after the opening statements. Then we will have what's called crossfire, 3 minutes of presentation, back and forth for 30 minutes, a total of 5 cycles of that. And then we will have 5-minute conclusions. Because of the time frame that we have this afternoon, we will not have an opportunity for audience questions after this debate, but we will have an opportunity this evening. So if you have a special question that you want to try to get asked involving the information that is discussed in this debate, make sure to write it down, because I assure you by this evening, if you're like me, you will have forgotten what it was. And then this evening you'll have that opportunity. Our debaters today, to my left, to your right, is David Wood. He is a teaching fellow at Fordham University, where he teaches philosophical ethics, which I find to be somewhat of a conundrum anyways. He holds degrees in biology and philosophy, and is co-author of the book, Who Was Jesus? Who Was Muhammad? Two Debates. He is unaware of this, but he was just yesterday elected as the president of the I Love to Travel Through Delaware fan club as well. Those of you here Friday know why that was. Shadid Lewis, to my right, is a convert to Islam, as we heard very eloquently last evening in the debate. Currently serves as president of the Hampton Mosque and Islamic Center. He has a certification in comparative religion from the Islamic Research and Propagation Center, and has studied the sciences of the Quran at the American Open Islamic University. And so I hope you will get out your pen and paper, and you will listen very, very carefully as these two gentlemen discuss, did Jesus rise from the dead? First 20-minute opening statement from David.
All right. Well, good afternoon. My thanks go out to Pastor Hardaway and Central Baptist Church for hosting these debates on Jesus' death, deity, and resurrection. And I think we should have debates like this every Easter, because this is the day Christians celebrate Jesus' resurrection from the dead, which we believe proved Christianity to be true. So I'm excited that Nabeel and I get to follow Jesus' example by showing that Christianity is true here on what we call Resurrection Sunday. I'd also like to thank Shadid for his confidence and courage in coming into a Baptist church on Easter Sunday to argue that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Since we're friends now, I can tell you you're in all kinds of trouble with God. Christians and Muslims agree on a number of issues. We agree that there is one God, all-powerful, all-knowing, holy, and good. We agree that God has sent messengers into the world, and that people like Abraham, Noah, Adam, David were mighty prophets. Concerning Jesus, we agree that he was born of a virgin, that he performed miracles, and that he was the Messiah. But we do have some disagreements on fundamental issues: the status of Muhammad and the Quran, the nature of God, whether he is triune, the reliability of the New Testament, and of course Jesus' death, deity, and resurrection. These areas of disagreement are extremely important for people who seek the truth. Because if Christianity claims one thing, and Islam claims something different, and it happens to be an area where we can go out and research to see where the evidence points, then we, even with all our limitations, can know what the true religion is. Jesus' death and resurrection are perfect for this task. Islam teaches that Jesus never died, that he wasn't even crucified, and hence that there was no resurrection. Christianity teaches that Jesus died by crucifixion and that God raised him on the third day. Both religions are making claims that can be investigated historically, which means that we can examine the evidence and determine which religion is confirmed by the facts. In this debate, I'm going to argue that Christianity is confirmed by the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. In order to prove my case, I'll need to do two things. First, I'll need to show that we have good evidence that Jesus died. And second, I'll need to show that we have good evidence that he was alive again after he died. Since the real dispute between Christians and Muslims is simply whether Jesus died by crucifixion, I'm going to give special attention to the evidence for Jesus' death and to some common Muslim objections to the facts of history. So, is there good evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion? Well, virtually every historical Jesus scholar on the planet says yes. Recently, Dr. Gary Habermas, one of the world's leading authorities on the evidence for the historical Jesus, completed a study of more than 2,700 modern scholarly works on the resurrection of Jesus. He added up the data and found that there are certain facts that just about all scholars agree on, and Jesus' death by crucifixion is at the top of the list. Conservative Christian scholars, liberal Christian scholars, even atheist and agnostic scholars agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Let's look briefly at what non-Christian scholars have to say. Atheist New Testament scholar Garrett Ludeman declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the infamous Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. According to Crossan, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. These are non-Christians. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar, not Christian, Jewish scholar Giza Vermi says that the Passion of Jesus is part of history. The Passion is the series of events leading up to and including Jesus' death by crucifixion. Another Jewish scholar, Pinchas Lapid, concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. According to Paula Fredrickson, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And since no discussion of non-Christian scholars would be complete without Art Ehrman, here's what Ehrman says. One of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Now let me be clear what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that we should believe whatever non-Christian scholars say. I'm pointing out the fact that on this issue, Jesus' crucifixion and death, even non-Christian scholars agree with the Christian view. And not only do they agree with us, they say that Jesus' death by crucifixion is indisputable, that it's historically certain, that it's one of the most certain facts of history. If you're a Christian, this scholarly consensus should make you feel good. Everyone agrees with us on this point, even people who can't stand what we believe. But if you're a Muslim, I think this should bother you. It would bother me if I were a Muslim. If I found out that everyone who was an expert in some field of research held that my belief was false, not just false, indisputably false, that would keep me up at night. But in my experience, I found that this just doesn't seem to bother Muslims at all. The Quran says Jesus didn't die, so Jesus didn't die, no matter how many experts say that the Quran is wrong. So among many Muslims, there's this complete trust in the Quran and an equally complete lack of regard for careful historical investigation. So we've seen that there's a scholarly consensus on the issue of Jesus' death by crucifixion. But let's take a look at some of the ancient sources that scholars consider when they investigate this matter. All four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, report the death of Jesus, and these are all first-century sources. I would put the Gospel of Mark in the 50s, and some scholars date the Mark and Passion narrative to within 7 years of Jesus' crucifixion. We also know of some ancient Christian creeds that predate the writing of the New Testament. The most important early creed is recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, though the creed is about 2 decades earlier, and some date it to within 5 years. Some date this creed to within, no, everyone dates it to within, almost everyone dates it to within 5 years. Some date it earlier, including some who date it within months. James D.G. Dunn, for instance, says, "This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death." So this is extremely early material. And what does our earliest evidence say? That Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. This was the official teaching of the early church. It was the official teaching of Jesus' apostles. But suppose we want to be unimaginably critical of the Gospels and even of the early creeds that predate the Gospels. Here we can turn to the second generation of Christian leaders, which included people like Papias, Ignatius, Clement of Rome, and Polycarp. We have writings and quotations from these men, which is important because some of them knew the apostles. Polycarp, for instance, was a disciple of the Apostle John. And what do we find when we turn to these writings? All we ever find is confirmation of the New Testament position that Jesus died on the cross. But even if we decide to throw out all Christian testimony, we would still have to conclude that Jesus died by crucifixion, because we can see it using non-Christian sources. For instance, we know that the first century historian Thallus was aware of Jesus' execution because in 52 AD, just 20 years after Jesus' death, Thallus tries to explain the darkness that was over the land during Jesus' crucifixion. Later in the first century, the Jewish historian Josephus, in Book 18 of his Antiquities, mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Not long after that, the Roman historian Tacitus, in Book 15 of his Annals, also says that Jesus was executed during the reign of Pontius Pilate. We could go on to discuss other sources, Mara bar Serapion, Lucian of Samosata, the Jewish Talmud, the writings of heretical groups, and so on, but it should be clear by now that all of the evidence we have tells us that Jesus died by crucifixion. And I challenge Shadid to find a single source written within a century after Jesus' death that says otherwise. The evidence, from a historical perspective, is conclusive. And yet the Quran says that Jesus didn't die and that he wasn't crucified. Well, if Jesus didn't die and he wasn't crucified, why does all of the historical evidence say that he was crucified and that he did die? Shadid needs to explain this. But let's discuss the most common Muslim answer, which is also the earliest. The most common Muslim explanation for the evidence we have is that God tricked everyone into thinking that Jesus died by crucifixion. According to this view, when the Jews got mad at Jesus, God took Jesus out of this world into heaven, and he disguised Judas to make him look like Jesus. So then Judas was put on the cross, and everyone saw Judas being crucified, but they thought it was Jesus because God had disguised him. So according to the Muslim view, the reason that all of the evidence supports the Christian position is that God did such a masterful job deceiving people into believing that Jesus died. My question for Shadid, if he supports this view, is why? Why did God trick everyone? Islam has a problem here because according to the Quran, Jesus' followers were good Muslims. And yet we know from history that Jesus' original followers came to believe that he died for their sins. So where did the early Christians get this idea that Jesus died? Well, if the Muslim explanation is correct, they apparently got this false idea from God. And if we keep following this explanation to where it leads, we can only conclude that God accidentally started Christianity when he tricked everyone into believing that Jesus died on the cross. Now, explanations like this are hard to accept if you're not already a Muslim. But Muslims are really forced into making these sorts of claims because Muhammad said things that just don't make sense in light of the evidence. History is a huge problem for Islam. So what do we have so far? Well, Christianity teaches that Jesus died by crucifixion. As we've seen, all of the historical evidence supports the Christian view. We have Christian sources, Jewish sources, and Roman sources, and these sources are in complete agreement on this point.
This explains why scholars are convinced that this issue is indisputable. Islam, on the other hand, teaches that Jesus didn't die and that he wasn't crucified. We have absolutely no evidence to support this claim. And in their attempt to explain why the evidence contradicts the Quran, Muslims have to bring in God as a deceiver who tricks people into believing false doctrines for no reason and accidentally starts false religions in the process. So these are the alternatives before us today. I say that we have good evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. The only question that remains then is whether we have good evidence that Jesus was alive again after he died. Let's consider three important facts and we can discuss the implications. Fact number one. On the Sunday after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was empty. We find this recorded in all four Gospels, including the early Mark and Passion narrative. But several other lines of evidence support the historicity of the empty tomb story. First, we know that the earliest Christian preaching took place in Jerusalem, and that the earliest Christian message was that Jesus had risen from the dead. But it would have been impossible for Christians to preach Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem if his body were still in the tomb. The tomb then must have been empty. Second, even Christianity's opponents admitted that the tomb was empty. We know this because the earliest non-Christian response to the Christian message was that the disciples had stolen the body. This is what the enemies of Christianity were saying. They stole it. But if non-Christians were trying to explain why the tomb was empty, they must have known that there was an empty tomb that needed to be explained. We now know, of course, that the disciples couldn't have stolen the body, because many of these same disciples were later martyred for their claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. And surely they wouldn't have suffered martyrdom for something they knew to be a lie. Third, according to the earliest accounts, the empty tomb was discovered by women. Some scholars consider this to be the strongest evidence that these accounts are true. In first century Israel, the testimony of women was considered far less reliable than the testimony of men. It follows then that if Christians were inventing the story of the empty tomb, they would have said that the tomb was discovered by male disciples like Peter, James, and John. So the only explanation for women being the primary witnesses of the empty tomb is that they really were the primary witnesses of the empty tomb. But if that's what really happened, then Jesus' tomb was empty on the third day after his crucifixion. Fact number two. Jesus' followers were convinced that he had appeared to them, risen from the dead. Although scholars certainly don't all agree that Jesus returned to life, almost everyone does admit that Jesus' followers believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. In the study I talked about a moment ago, Habermas found that the vast majority of scholars hold that the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the resurrected Christ. Scholars disagree about the nature of these experiences. Some say Jesus really appeared. Others say that the disciples must have been hallucinating because people don't rise from the dead. But nearly everyone agrees that the disciples sincerely believed that Jesus had appeared to them. According to Gerrit Ludemann, the atheist New Testament scholar, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Likewise, Paula Fredrickson states, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know as a historian that they must have seen something. And we can't forget Bart Ehrman, who says that we can say with complete certainty that some of the disciples at some later time insisted that A, women from their group went to anoint Jesus' body for burial and found it missing, and B, he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. Ehrman also says that it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. Now, why do scholars agree that Jesus' disciples believed that he had risen from the dead? Well, we know from history that the apostles were preaching that Jesus had appeared to them. We know this from the early creed we talked about, which says that Jesus appeared to Peter, to the rest of the apostles, to James, and to more than 500 people at one time. Again, this creed goes back to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion, and some say within months. We also know from the Gospels, from the letters of Paul, and other New Testament writers, and from the writings of the early church fathers, that Jesus' disciples were preaching that he had appeared to them. But not only do we know that the earliest Christians were preaching that Jesus had appeared to them, we also know that they weren't making it up, because many of them were later tortured and killed because they wouldn't stop proclaiming that Jesus is Lord and that he rose from the dead. Now, people can die for something that's false, but they have to at least believe that it's true. In other words, no one's going to die for something they know is a lie. And this means that Jesus' followers really believed that he had appeared to them. Fact number 3. Some of Jesus' foes, his enemies, were also convinced that he had appeared to them. We know historically that certain people who were originally weren't followers of Jesus became Christians because they were also convinced that he had appeared to them. James was Jesus' oldest brother, and he completely rejected Jesus during his earthly ministry. And yet the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that James was eventually stoned to death because he wouldn't stop preaching the Christian message. So what changed James from a disbeliever to a believer? Well, we know from the early Christian creed that James was convinced that Jesus had appeared to him. We also know that the Apostle Paul converted based on his belief that Jesus had appeared to him. Muslims tend to make all sorts of accusations against Paul, which I find somewhat disturbing, considering one, that there is no evidence for the Muslim claims about Paul, and two, that Paul is one of the greatest, most dedicated followers of God who has ever walked this planet. But what's clear from the historical evidence is that Paul was a fanatical persecutor of the early church. As a Pharisee, Paul considered the Christian message of Jesus' sacrificial death, resurrection, and deity to be absolute heresy. And so he tried to destroy the early church. But as he was on his way to Damascus to persecute Christians, Paul converted because he too came to believe that Jesus had appeared to him. Now there's other evidence we could discuss, and I'm sure that some of it will come out in the course of this debate. But I think we have enough to conclude that Jesus rose from the dead. We know that Jesus' tomb was found empty by some of his female followers on the Sunday after his crucifixion. We also know that both friends and foes were soon claiming that they had seen the risen Jesus. They were so convinced that Jesus had appeared to them that they were willing to endure torture and death for the privilege of proclaiming the Christian gospel. The question for us is this: what could have convinced these people that Jesus had appeared to them? This is the question I struggled with 12 years ago when I was a fanatical atheist. I just couldn't explain away these facts. I couldn't think of any theory other than the resurrection which actually accounted for all of the historical evidence. I concluded that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, and I submitted to him as Lord. To sum up, we've considered two competing views. Christians believe that Jesus died by crucifixion and that he rose from the dead 3 days later. Muslims believe that Jesus never died and that he was taken up into heaven. As we've seen, all of the available evidence supports the Christian view. There's no evidence anywhere that supports the Muslim view. Of course, a person can still believe what Surah 4:157 says, in spite of the overwhelming evidence against it. And if you're satisfied with believing things that are completely at odds with all of history, you can believe whatever you want. But for those of you who want a belief that fits the facts when facts are available, you'll have to look somewhere other than Islam. And I've never seen any religion that fits the facts as well as Christianity.
Now, 20-minute opening statement from Shadid.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. And greetings to the Christians in the audience. I just want to say very quickly, when David opened up, he talked about this day, and he mentioned Easter. I find that interesting that Christians constantly refer to this day, Easter, which is the name of a pagan goddess. So if you say you're believers of God, just as a little advice, I would say stop using this term Easter, because that is the name of the pagan goddess of fertility. So it's interesting that that name is used, sometimes even on your churches. It is the name of a pagan goddess. Be sure of that. But on the subject matter, David said that the Muslims, because of all the evidence, we have to stay up late at night. That would have been the case if we didn't have evidence that goes against what he has to say. So we don't have to stay up all night because there's evidence that supports our position. Now, the Quran in Surah 4, verse 157, says, speaking about the situation concerning Jesus, it says, "And because of their saying, we killed the Messiah, but they killed him not, nor crucified him, but it was made to appear so to them. And those who differ therein are full of doubts. They have no certain knowledge of it. They follow nothing but conjecture. For surely they killed him not." Now what is conjecture? Conjecture is the formation of opinion without sufficient evidence. And I will show that that is exactly what the Christian position is. It is insufficient evidence what they base their opinion upon. Now, in the Arabic, there are different Muslim views about what happened. And if you check the historical scholarly debates about it, Muslims had different opinions. Some had the substitution theory, others had that they took it that appeared meant it looked like he was killed, so forth and so on. But let me just be clear for that position. If you look at the Arabic does not say that he was substituted. This is just something that some Muslims held, because the Arabic word is shubha. It means that a likeness or similitude. It could mean a likeness or similitude of Jesus, a likeness or similitude of killing, a likeness or similitude of crucifixion, or a likeness or killing of either or both. Okay, and lahum means was made for them. Okay, the Arabic word for substitution is a totally different word. Okay, it is a totally different word. But again, that is some Muslim theories. Now, from my research that I've seen, that it appears that this substitution theory has come, it existed before Muslims, in fact. You see? It existed before some Muslim, in fact. To be clear, the Arabic word for substitution is, excuse my pronunciation, Naib, Wakil, Halifa. That is substitute as a person, meaning a person was substituted, or a substitute person. And substitution as a verb, the word is amirhu awad, or yamalhu awad. Okay? So that word, those words are not in what the Arabic says. So we take what Allah said. Allah said it was made to appear, it was made to appear. Whatever that means, Allah knows best. Okay? But the substitution theory is not new to Islam. Okay? If you look, for example, and of course, first of all, we know that the Christians at the beginning, they had many documents floating around before they came up with their canonized, the particular canon that they accepted. There were many different gospels and books and writings circulating around before they decided what was official. So don't be misled into thinking that it was all cut and dry from the beginning. That is not true. There were many different writings. Okay, and for example, the substitution theory spoken of in the Apocalypse of Peter. Okay, where it speaks about that Jesus was glad and laughing, and it reads, "Him whom you see on the tree, glad and laughing, this is the living Jesus. But this one into whose hands and feet they drive nails is his fleshy part, which is the substitute being put to shame, the one who came into being in his likeness. But look at him and me." This does not originate with Islam. And from what I read, it appears that they said maybe perhaps some of the Gnostics may have converted to Islam and spread this amongst the Muslims, and Muslims may have accepted that. Allah knows best again. It's interesting to know about this, that Clement of Alexandria regards the Apocalypse of Peter as holy scriptures. Okay? This is testified to in the New Testament Apocrypha by C. Detlef G. Mueller, Volume 2, page 262. You have the second treatise of the Great Set, which was a Gnostic. Of course, modern-day Christians rejected. But we'll get into something interesting, that you find a portion of the Gnostic theory within their New Testament today, as I'll show you in just a moment. So here we read in the second treatise of the Great Set. It says, Jesus says, "It was another, Simon, who bore the cross on his shoulders. It was another upon whom they placed the crown of thorns. But I was rejoicing in the height, laughing at their ignorance." Okay, we have a statement by, and excuse my pronunciation, it's a Greek name, Irenaeus, in the late 2nd century, in a complaint about the beliefs of Egyptian Gnostics, Balisates. He explains that this heretic taught that Jesus had been substituted during the journey to Golgotha, and that this substitute, Simon of Cyrene, had died in Jesus' stead. That is from the Jesus Papers by Michael Bagley.